This is episode 234 of Mitolife Radio. I'm your host, Matt Blackburn, and today I'm interviewing Shawn Bean. He is a second-time guest. The first show we talked about getting floxed, which is the slang for basically saying that you got poisoned by consuming fluoroquinolones such as ciprofloxacin, norfloxacin, ofloxacin, all of the fluoroquinolones that are often prescribed. And there's long-term debilitating effects from those that Shawn talked about in our first show. So if that interests you, go back and listen to that one. This show is about long-haul COVID. So recurring symptoms. Maybe you had COVID the last couple of years and you still feel like you have the brain fog, the loss of taste or smell, the general fatigue, maybe even depression or anxiety or gut issues. The list of symptoms is long, and Shawn explains why that is the case. He's been studying human health for over 18 years, working with doctors on complex medical cases that go beyond the normal scope of traditional medicine. He looks at environmental stressors, hormonal imbalances, nutrition, a person's history, and puts it all together to get to the root cause of their health issue. So here we go. Here is Shawn Bean. All right, Shawn Bean, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Matt, for having me back.
Yeah, I loved our first chat on getting floxed. You have a lot of great information about that situation, which a lot of people have experienced. And so if you haven't heard that one, go back and listen to that. Today, we're going to be talking about long COVID, or sometimes it's called long hauler COVID. And it's basically long-term effects after getting COVID-19, and that could linger for months to years. And if you look up the symptoms of it, it's pretty much everything. Rashes, joint pain, muscle pain, diarrhea, depression, anxiety, sleep issues, headaches, brain fog, fatigue is a huge one, right? Cardiovascular things, obviously the long-term change in taste and smell. I mean, there's so many symptoms of it, right?
There's a laundry list of symptoms.
Yeah. And so how do you know, it's kind of like when this all was happening for 2 years, people were going to the hospital for other things. And because they got a kickback, the hospitals they just diagnosed it as COVID, right? Yeah. But now we're in a situation where a lot of people do have real symptoms. I mean, I experienced it 3 times and it wasn't too bad. I mean, no more than a week each time, sometimes even 3 to 4 days I was back on my feet. But I do feel like I had long symptoms, like brain fog for sure, fatigue for sure. Just didn't feel the same. And, I've looked into hyperbaric oxygen therapy. There's all of these different therapies that you could use to help recover from long COVID. But what's kind of your approach when someone comes to you and says they think they're experiencing symptoms?
The first thing I would look for is history. What I see is COVID is actually acting as a catalyst. A lot of the times the immune system has been keeping other things in check for up to decades. And a lot of the people that I deal with who had, that come to me, I'm like, have you had mold exposure in the past? Oh yeah. Have you been treated? Yes. And then all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. It's like, God, this is like going through mold all over again. I said, yeah. And you have a valid point, because what happens is your immune system keeps everything in check. And as soon as that glass full is half empty, half full, you get pushed over. And you could have a mold infection or mold exposure from 10 years ago. that your immune system was keeping in check, then all of a sudden, boom, it gets open, it gets activated. Or you'll start to see other viruses get activated. Lyme gets activated. But what I found is when you look at the overall picture, a lot of these viruses and everything are actually representation of the activation of the mycotoxin itself. And that's where we're seeing the treatments that when I come into people, when I do the organic acid test, I tell them, it's like, you look like you have the chemistry of an alcoholic. Okay. But what you don't understand is the phenols and the mycotoxins are actually alcohols themselves, biochemically similar. And then, I've been doing these organic acid tests for well over a decade, and we've never seen the specific patterns show up, specifically the one on, it's called not methylonic acid, but methylonate. It's all the way down to the bottom of the organic acid test. And I've been seeing that hit up like a Christmas tree. And what that one is that's an indication of what's called carbon-1 metabolism. Carbon-1 metabolism is the intersection between, I always refer to it as it's like the B12 bully versus the nerds. And what happens is it's the cellular transport of B12. When you look in the clinical literature, it's hydrogen sulfide, nitric oxide, aldehydes, alcohol, and mycotoxins that are the bullies that kick B12 off the bus. And when you have the transporters not working right, that B12 is not going to get there. So you're going to end up with similar symptoms associated with B12 deficiency, but at the cellular level. And this is why I often run the B12 binding capacity, the B12 binding capacity test, which is basically, you can get it online and usually comes up very, very low. And what that basically means is that you may not have enough transporters to carry B12 into the system. So you may need higher dosages, 5,000, 10,000 in order to get the transport system working. The other mechanism we often find is within that pathway, scientific studies have shown that thiamine deficiency is necessary for B12 metabolism. And often what happens is people are coming to me with elevated 5-HIAA across the board. And what 5-HIAA is, it's a serotonin that mimics NET, which is neuroendocrine tumor, or CAH. And what's happening is they're coming across looking as they have CAH, but in reality, when you dig deeper, there's mechanisms that thiamine is needed to metabolize serotonin. And I found that in literature, in PubMed. So what happens is this COVID is a catalyst for these other reactions that are taking place and these gene expressions that are being turned on. And that's where doing clinical, you want to look at the terrain first. I can't emphasize how many times when people came to me with gut microbiome testing, I said, listen, if you don't get this in line now, you're going to have problems down the road. Specifically when I saw the low secretory IgA. And the low secretory IgA with the Prevotella was indication that there was fungal issues getting ready to happen. And what happens? They get COVID, and next thing you know, they're dying. Well, they were notified. They had the warning signs that you have to get your gut in check. If you don't, you're going to be a higher probability of being a long hauler. And people that listened did very well. People that didn't listen were coming back, having the neurological problems, having more gut problems. And I mentioned this over a year or so ago before it went public. I said, listen, guys, I'm seeing a drop in the bifidobacterium from the start to when people get COVID. I mentioned that multiple times. That's often due to the FUT2 gene expression. And oftentimes we see low alkaline phosphatase come across the board. And we know that low alkaline phosphatase is associated with gut microbiomes, and also it's associated with, guess what? Celiac or celiac related conditions. That's why when I see alkaline phosphatase drop, you know you're dealing with some type of mucosa issue. And then you also see it a lot of times in people, again, that have mycotoxosis as a result, fungal or mold. And it was interesting that you see the drop of the alkaline phosphatase, and in males, you see the rise of the SHBG, which is synonymous. Because one case I was working with, you could see the SHBG high, and then took a drop down. I said, I bet you were feeling good here, and this was a house that you're safe in. And he's like, oh my God, Shawn, I never felt better in my life. So he actually had a tracking mechanism to be able to identify where he was safe at based upon his SHBG.
Wow. Shawn, I want to circle back. The B12 thing you mentioned is really interesting. So last year, I got the urine methylmalonic acid test done. And I was in range, and I know when it's out of whack, it'll increase and spill over into the urine and increase the level. And that's the test that you do. Would, like you mentioned, the B12 binding capacity test, do you also look at this one with long haulers? Like, is there any relationship? Or
there is definitely a relationship, because we see a lot of people that have extremely low. Like, for example, mine, the bottom range was 700. Okay. Mine came back to 312. I've always done micro, spectral cell testing, and spectral cell testing always came up low despite all the B12 supplements I was taking. Same thing with going to IVs. For me to override that mechanism, the amount of B12 that had to be in my body had to be close to 5,000 to 10,000. The the measurement in blood,
right? Wow.
In order to override. And it's very similar in autism. They use the same mechanism. They use Dr. Vader came up with a protocol that they used, sometimes 20 milligrams of methyl B12 at a shot. I mean, when I worked with one of the practitioners I was working with, she had me at 20 milligrams 2 times a week. But then we didn't have electromagnetic fields. Then we didn't have all this glyphosates and food. I mean, with mold, I recovered within 6 weeks. Now it's being drawn out. And I'm still going through it with probably about 4 or 5 other practitioners that are fighting for their dear lives. And we have access to the most brilliant minds. And it doesn't make me a bad practitioner. It just shows you how devastating this condition is and what it can really do. I mean, there's days on where I can barely get out of bed, or I might be more autistic because of the expressions that are in my genetics. And I have a lot of people that come to me when I make that statement, like, oh my God, I feel like an autistic child. I said, yes, we're seeing, quote, more ASD symptoms as people get older. And they're coming Asperger's and on the ASD spectrums. But I just think it's the underlying factors that were predisposition that are mimicking these conditions. Because we do know that mycotoxins are associated with a higher probability of autism. And when we were in COVID, where were we at? We were in confined areas, no air, and studies have shown 50% or more of the buildings in America have water damage or have had water damage. So if your immune system's compromised, you're exposed to that. Your immune system is going to eventually weaken. Your gut microbiome is going to take a nosedive. You're going to be more susceptible. to those conditions.
Where are most of those homes, Shawn? Do they tend to be close, coast to coast coastlines, or does it not matter? It could be anywhere in the country, or are there like safer areas generally?
Mostly on the coastline. I know Pennsylvania, mostly older if you look in the history, the colonial style homes would be like in Boston, Pennsylvania, the 13 original colonies.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't, I've had clients that had brand new houses built that when they had mold inspectors go in, that there was leaks in there. Even when I was visiting for new houses, they didn't disclose where the mold was. But in one of the houses, I went down and I felt uncomfortable and I almost had to get pulled up out of the stairs. And when the realtor went back and looked, she goes, Shawn, she goes, that area that you were having your problems in? I said, yeah. She goes, there was a leak there several years ago, and they actually covered it up.
But the canary in the coal mine.
Canary in the coal mine, exactly. So I always refer to myself as a moldar. And listen, everything's not about mold. If it's in the history, that's where I'm going to go with. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm not a specialist in mold. I don't, you go in, you find Lyme. You have Lyme. It's the idea that the history supports it, the biochemical pathways are supporting it, and you have all this clinical data pointing to that as a probability. Now, what we're starting to find is that some of the urine tests are not accurate because some of the people doing the urine test can't provoke it because of their sensitivity to glutathione. Or some of the labs, you're not supposed to use glutathione because of the fact it's the method that they use for measuring. I just had that today. Client comes in and I looked at the organic acid test and said, your glutathione levels are in a garbage can. Okay. And you can't take glutathione. So everything came back negative on the laboratory test. And I told her, I said, let's stop the BS and let's get straight to the chase. So I have all my clients use the MyMicroLabs test, which is a blood test, which found mine. Okay. Because it missed it. And once I know what I'm dealing with, sometimes I'll catch it in the GI MAPS test, because of the patterns. And by knowing the mycotoxins identifies what the organism is, then it shows you how to approach it. Like you don't use on Fusarium, you don't use glutathione, but you use calcium glucarate because it works through the glucuronidation pathway, where gliotoxin you got to be careful with, because if you give glutathione to gliotoxin, you're going to add fuel to the fire. So sometimes what happens is the body lowers your antioxidants as a protective mechanism. Same thing happens in the GI tract. Your body's microbiome is going to shift in order to try to help out and backup systems. And this is what we're starting to see is nature is a wonderful, has an ability to adapt, but nature was never designed to have glyphosates. Nature was never designed to have these other factors going in. So it's only doing what it's supposed to be doing naturally, trying to help out, but it's getting blocked. And when it's getting blocked, is people end up with sulfur issues or sulfate intolerance, or they're having glutathione problems. I know it sounds contradictory, but every time I see high H. pylori on a stool sample test, I know that they're probably going to have problems in the glutathione pathway because your body's lacking sulfate. So in that situation, I just had a client today. They had H. pylori. We use Epsom salt baths. Sulfur sensitivity, guess what? Went away. They were able to tolerate foods that they couldn't have before. So
Wow.
just by looking at the microbiome, you don't go into kill mode. The body's trying to adapt itself. And clinicians, we have to understand these adaptations, especially with COVID coming in. Because your body's just trying to shift to try to get to that glutathione. So you might see the rise of the H. pylori. You might see Clostridia come up as a protective mechanism. May not be so bad, because guess what? The byproduct of Clostridia is phenols, and phenolinic acid is one of the most powerful, guess what? Antifungals there is. So we have to understand and ask ourselves, what is the body trying to tell us?
Right. Yeah. And I know with COVID, a lot of the recommendations, the natural recommendations were zinc and vitamin C. Vitamin D was in there too, but zinc and vitamin C were big ones. And we know that there's this intimate relationship between ascorbic acid and glutathione, that they function together as like an antioxidant couple. And we were talking about vitamin deficiencies before we started recording, and I was looking into that last year, looking at all the fat soluble vitamins and then the water soluble vitamins. And it seemed like with every single one, there was a relationship to COVID, like where COVID would lower even ones we don't think about, like vitamin E. It was incredible.
Yeah, vitamin E is like unsung hero. What that thing can do when you look into the chemistry of it is absolutely amazing. With your products and stuff, one of your listeners were having problems because they were something about the coconut in it, and I told her, I said, cut the thing open and rub it on your face, because vitamin E is transdermal. A lot of people don't know vitamin E can be transdermally applied and get through the skin and get into the bloodstream system. I had a client who was taking vitamin E topically and able to sustain staying in her mycotoxin-filled office. She could breathe. And one day she emailed me, said, Shawn, she goes, I forgot my vitamin E and I couldn't breathe. So in that scenario, I told her, said, now you just proved my hypothesis that, because vitamin E can create, vitamin E deficiency creates anemia. You need it to fire the adrenals. You need it for luteinizing hormone for testosterone. You need it for a whole bunch of different things. You need it to, it's in the glutathione cycle. If glutathione's down, vitamin E is going to be down. If glutathione's down, vitamin C is going to be down. If you can't recycle vitamin C without vitamin E. Right. It also protects you against electromagnetic fields. Vitamin C, vitamin E, and beta glucans were shown in studies to protect you from specific frequencies on electromagnetic fields.
I didn't know that about beta glucans. That's really cool.
Well, beta glucans, that's why I said, remember I told you about the product we're talking about? Because beta glucans, what they do is they help to re-stimulate, they help to immune system, but they also allow the body to repair itself through the microbiome. They can actually allow the microbiome to shift. They're great immune modulators. They work, one of your favorite guests from Healthy Gut, Stephen, the product that there was dying had the beta glucans in it. And that thing has been wonderful because that beta glucans stabilize the immune system. They balance out TH1 and TH2. And there's a lot of simple things people can do when you come to COVID. And I think a lot of practitioners are, again, turning molehills into mountains when they don't need to be. And just doing the basics, Epsom salt baths, getting out. Lady just told me today, she goes, Shawn, those sunlight walks that you had me going on, oh my God, I feel amazing. I said, yeah, well, you're taking advantage of the MSH in your system. You're getting the red light coming in to stimulate a lot of the MSH receptors. So then when you go out to the sun, you can actually not react. And then I had her build her nitric oxide pathway up by using the nitrates.
Hmm.
I'm using just plain old arugula because the arugula helped stabilize the microbiome. It gave her a nice sulfur component, but it was also loaded in nitrates too.
It's funny you mentioned red light. I just got a prototype. My friend sent me of a wrist 660 and 850 nanometer light to put on your, like the Quantlet, which I didn't work out. that went under, but this is like a affordable one without the cooling effect. But I guess red light increases NO locally, which has benefit.
It does, but with anything, you can't make something out of nothing. And when it comes to nitrates, there is a glutathione nitrate combo, because what happens is you have to have the balance between nitrates and glutathione to create nitroglutathione, which is the stored form of nitrates. So when people go out into the sun, what happens is number one, it stimulates sulfate production, which can stimulate detoxification reaction. But they may need more vitamin E, because vitamin E is protective against the sun.
Vitamin A, right?
Vitamin A, vitamin E. Vitamin A gets demonized all over the place too.
Right.
And that's a whole nother story. But you need the antioxidant support. People, I don't respond to the sun. I said, well, do you understand that you can stimulate nitric oxide from the sun, but if you don't have the nitrates on board, it could be problematic. So you have to have those nitrates on board. Once I start loading people with nitrates, with arugula. Same clients that couldn't tolerate sun. Shawn, I can walk out in the sun now, not react.
Wow. What about beets? Are you a fan of beets? Or
beets are very high in oxalates. The one thing that I did find outside of beets is red spinach extract. Red spinach extract comes from aramis, which is the grain. But again, you've got 0 oxalates, 0 sugars, and you get 235 milligrams of nitrates per serving out of this one company. And I've had everybody talk to me about it, and they love it because you can take it with any kind of sensitivity, so to speak, because it's so universal.
Interesting. I'll have to grow that up north in the greenhouse. That sounds red spinach, to look into that. Yeah, that's interesting. Last thing I'll say on B12, because I know we talked about it quite a bit, but would you mentioned 5 to 10,000, and that's micrograms, right, on the supplement a day to kind of bypass, to get the transporter working, like you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Would that temporarily relieve someone's symptoms, like while they're fixing the root cause? It'd probably be like an expensive way to do it, but I'm just curious about that.
It could be a very expensive way to do it, but again, you've got to take the steps and the sequence into response. Okay. So there's a whole scenario that goes behind that. Like I may prep them with lithium, right. I may prep them with some benfotiamine. I may prep them with make sure there's folate on board, because the more B12 you get, the more folate you chew up, depending on what type. So I'll go in and probably be safe and use hydroxy B12, because hydroxy B12 seems to be the more neutral one out of all of them. And what I'll also do is I'll up their potassium levels, because we found, it was shown that high levels of B12 can deplete potassium. So I'll load with potassium. That's why I use different forms of potassium, whether it's water or different products that have a higher potassium level. When I'm going with potassium, I like to use potassium bicarb, just because of the fact it's got other properties that help with small bacterial overgrowths, and it helps to neutralize a lot of hydrogen sulfide.
Wow, interesting.
So whenever a hydrogen sulfide overgrowth gets overstimulated in me, the thing that calms me down is the one product I like to use is Optimal Electrolyte from Seeking Health.
Would magnesium is it the bicarbonate ion that's having that effect in general, or?
I just think it's the bicarb itself. but certain people respond to different things to sodium versus potassium versus magnesium. Like when I do my butyrates, depending upon the person, I tend to go with sodium butyrate just because of there's more likely to have an adrenal issue going on, or if they have lower blood pressure. Now, if they have higher blood pressure, I don't go with sodium, but I'll go with a calcium magnesium butyrate. So making recommendations is not just a science, but it's more of an art. And working with COVID comes in line with that because it's not a protocol-based approach. It's a very systematic, bio-individual approach that's going to get you the best response. And that's why where some clinical testing is necessary, but these clients come into me that are COVID from other practitioners, have this unnecessary laundry list of testing, costs them thousands and thousands of dollars. They'll come in on peptides and growth hormones and testosterone, and women come in on bioidentical hormones with pellets. And it's like, you've just got to take a deep breath and just go back to the basics. You know, what type of water are you drinking? How often getting out in the sun? You know, are you taking Epsom salt baths in dirty water? You know, why take an Epsom salt bath? Where are you at? New York. Okay, so you're filling your bathtub up with contaminated water that's being pushed, you know, the chloride and fluoride is being directly pushed into your water. And because you got Epsom salt, opens up, boom, it goes in. That's why when I started working with autistic kids, they had responses to the Epsom salt. It wasn't the response to the Epsom salt, it was the fact that they had dirty water. And once we switched that water out by using, you know, just a filter that may have been appropriate, or, you know, maybe doing a foot bath, or maybe sometimes people are so sensitive. There's a product that I use that's Epsom salt cream. That if you're on the go, you know, Shawn, I can't do an Epsom salt bath. Yeah, but you can take a cream and apply it 2 or 3 times a day. That's basically from your top of your finger down to your knuckle 3 times a day and get some benefit from it. So, you know, where there's a will, there's a way.
I like that you mentioned sunlight, because I have a lot of experience with this living in a pretty far northern climate with pretty heavy real winters for several, you know, months, getting down to single digits and even negative degrees Fahrenheit. Do you work with clients? You know, I know you're pretty north, but do you work with clients in northern latitudes and, you know, ones that have to use devices, whether it's, you know, lights to regulate their circadian rhythm in the morning to wake up, or red light devices or UV lights or things like that? And I know vitamin D is only one aspect of sunlight. It's important, but there's so many other aspects to light, right? Like we touched on a few of them earlier.
I had one case that went to multiple practitioners and tried many different therapies, and they were in like northern Canada. I asked them, I said, "Where's the closest tanning bed?" They're like, "Why?" I said, "Do you understand the chemistry that your MSH is deficient? And that way, if you get the MSH going, it's going to heal your gut, it's going to heal your brain, it's going to shut down the pro-inflammatory cytokines." She's like, "No, nobody's mentioned that." I said, "I want you to go tanning. You're not going to look pretty in the wintertime. You're going just to get some UV light on your skin, just to activate some things." 3 weeks later, her symptoms were 60% better. No, you know, she reduced a lot of her supplements. She didn't need half of them. And she felt the best she's felt in years. And all she was doing was missing light. That's why I'm talking about doing the simple things first.
Wow. And that's melanocyte stimulating hormone, right? For the layperson.
Yes, it's melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, which most people with mold, COVID, are deficient in. And people also with mycotoxosis. When I'm talking about mycotoxosis, I'm talking about fungus, mold. They're all grouped together. Because what happens is the byproducts and the chemistry is the same. It's an alcohol derivative. So I always tell people it's like you're a non-functioning alcoholic, you know? And they're like, with the chemistry of not being in that, with the chemistry of not, and not drinking.
Yeah.
And that resonates with them, you know?
Yeah.
When you start addressing COVID as as they were alcoholics, and as they have a traumatic brain injury, they start getting better.
Is acetaldehyde a component to this, Shawn? Because I interviewed, well, I'll let you answer that first. Yeah.
There's different conversions. It's usually ethanol gets converted into the acetaldehyde. And there's different pathways where you have a buildup of one and not enough of the other. Some people can break down the ethanol, but then they build up the acetyl. Some people can break down not the ethanol, but they can break down the acetyl. But the end game is the same because they're very chemically similar.
Wow. Interesting. Because I interviewed a guy on my show that created Probiotics, a company, like for drinking. And when I got that product, I don't do that well on alcohol. So I don't do it. I don't drink often. But when I bought it and started taking it, I started to feel just generally better. And I was starting to try to hypothesize why. And I was wondering, with what you're talking about, if you're having acetaldehyde in your gut and you're not even drinking tequila or wine or whatever, that could potentially help, right?
Correct. What happens is some of the microorganisms in your GI tract, beneficial or pathogenic, produce phenols. And when you have phenol overload and you have a phenyl sulfur transferase issue going on or something that's blocking that, you're going to build up those phenols. That's why one of the things I do with COVID now is I use a homeopathic that's a phenol that decreases phenol sensitivity. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're desensitizing the person to the actual phenols itself. Because in homeopathic, like treats like. And we're phenols, aldehydes. I always tell people we're living in sea of aldehydes. Between the perfumes, the stuff that we utilize, but those are all alcohol. That's why glutathione works for a lot of people. I had a client who was a practitioner. It's like, Shawn, I always get drunk. And it's like, I looked at his pathways. He was relatively pretty healthy. He had mold toxicity. We put him on glutathione injections. He went to Mexico on a honeymoon with his wife and was able to drink and not get drunk and have hangovers. That was because we looked at the pathways, we looked how things were going, and I said, listen, you're okay to do glutathione because you're recycling okay, you're relatively healthy, you just have this alcohol intolerance.
How many milligrams for the injections? Or is it like normally it's like 500, I guess, pretty good dose.
We're doing it sub-Q injections, 200 milligrams Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Okay.
And it worked out perfectly like a charm. I had a client right now that she's in her late 40s. I put her on vitamin E with glutathione injections with astaxanthin. Her skin within 3 weeks was completely different.
Wow.
Because I had her microbiome test and I showed that her Akkermansia was depleted. So I used astaxanthin to raise the Akkermansia because it's been shown that it actually increases it 12 times.
Wow. Because I know there's that company, is it Pendulum, selling Akkermansia? Would you like this?
I don't see the rise in the Akkermansia. I don't see the clinical applications in that. I'm not saying it's a bad product. I'm just not seeing the clinical outcomes.
I didn't feel anything from it. I took it for a few months. So
that's why it's like I'll use apple, your polyphenols, and your apple, Joel Green, it's got the apple peels, 3 or 4 apple peels a day. I'll use astaxanthin. And people sometimes are scared of vitamin A. So astaxanthin is a carotenoid. So it gives you all the benefits of vitamin A to some degree without the toxicity.
I know when I had COVID, I can't remember if it's the second time or something. I had a Myers cocktail at the house, and I had 500 milligrams of glutathione straight into the vein with, ascorbic acid. I can't remember how many milligrams. It might have been 5,000 milligrams of ascorbic. And then, the B complex and all that. And I felt immediately better. And I think it did help acutely. If someone wants to just shotgun it and they don't want to go to, to get guidance from someone like you, and just, would it help with long haul as well as acute, in your opinion, to get that like once a week or once a month or something?
It's interesting that you bring this up, because one of those people, one of my colleagues that I've been working with, I told her to ramp up her liposomal vitamin C to 3 to 5 milligrams a day. Immediately turned around. And then I'm like, listen, you're a doctor. It'll be highly recommended you to get infusions of vitamin C, 25 grams or 50 grams. Okay. When I go get vitamin C IVs, I will get no lower than 50 grams at a pop. I've gone up to 100 grams. And
that's more of a pro-oxidant effect, right?
There's tricks to the trades on how to knock that down. Because you think vitamin C is powerful, you add DMSO to it. There's no way to describe it. It's like, it makes vitamin C look like nothing. And it's almost like when that DMSO goes in with that push, you can feel the inflammation come down. And one of the practitioners I go to, she worked actually at the Rodin Institute.
Oh.
She's crazy. Okay. She knows her stuff. But she has what's called the Lazarus bag. It's called the Lazarus bag for a reason. Because it will bring you back from the dead. Because one time I went in there looking alien gray. She popped that bag in there first time. It was like the Terminator. Come on. That's when you get when you got a good bag.
Wow. It's tricky because I know with my IV nurse, I was able to choose the form, and sometimes you can work with your nurse to, like, as far as B12, right? You mentioned earlier, there's a form that you prefer. There's like methyl, cyano, hydroxy, and some people do better with different forms, right? Depending on how they methylate.
Yeah. And she's probably hanging between 50 to 60,000 bags. Okay. Wow. And she rarely sees the bags she uses. She rarely sees reactions. I think it's the way that the bag is set up. One of the things that I have learned from Dr. Paul Anderson is that you may want to do your glutathione on the opposite days of your vitamin C because of the oxidative stress effect. And by doing the glutathione, you just kind of like overwash it. And he actually made note of that. Even if he's a cancer doctor and one of the best, I feel, there's a reason that you can take some of that philosophy from cancer and overlay it into other conditions. Because a lot of them do cross over. So I look at the mechanisms and I look at the philosophies. And I'm like, that makes sense. Because sometimes when you put glutathione into a bag, it can oxidize relatively fast. That's why they usually do the push at the end. But what he's recommending and what I've looked into, if you're doing high dosage of vitamin C, you may want to have an off day to where you do your glutathione.
Interesting.
Just some suggestions. Because you might have that pro-oxidant. Because remember, vitamin C oxidizes. So if that glutathione is not getting in, there's a possibility that that vitamin C oxidizes. If you take glutathione on a separate day, you reduce the oxidation of, because you're doing it completely on a separate day, you may reduce the chances of vitamin C oxidizing.
And if it's low, like in say 5 grams of C,
that's
it probably wouldn't matter, right?
That wouldn't matter. 2 to 5 grams wouldn't matter. Once you get over that 25 gram mark, you really need to be with somebody who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, and I know most nurses require you to get a doctor's note to get high dose C, right? Because there could be a reaction, I guess. I don't know, or it's a liability thing.
When you're dealing with higher dosages, you may want to look up G6PD and actually run a G6PD just to play safe.
Mm-hmm.
But a good skilled practitioner.
That's a genetic mutation, right?
That's a genetic mutation because you got to watch G6PD with vitamin C. Not a good thing. Okay. Same thing with antiphospholipid syndrome is another one you have to watch out for.
G6PD, do you think that's pretty common? Do you see that a lot? Or
yeah, G6PD is normally more in Mediterranean. And what that is G6PD was actually a protective mechanism against a specific disease that was common down there. But that gene could be transferred through, marriage. Because one of our kids has G6PD. That's genetically. When you have kids, genetically, it's one of the screens that they do, and they alert us.
Is that a reduced tolerance to exogenous vitamin C, or?
It's more of you have to watch what's called fava beans.
Oh, interesting.
And also high dosages of vitamin C. You want to be cautious of.
Okay. I didn't mean exogenous vitamin C. We can't make it, right? So I misspoke there.
There supposedly, there's a claim on a supplement called Nanosoma that they actually are able to get your body generating vitamin C by itself.
Interesting. Huh.
I would like to see the scientific literature on that one.
Right. I meant to ask you earlier with the B vitamins. Like I interviewed Ellie Overton on my show for 2 hours, really in depth on just thiamine. Do you use different forms sometimes with different clients? Like I still have a bunch of his TTFD, so I'll pop. I'm a wild man, but I'll pop like 4 or 5 capsules at once, and I actually don't feel anything. I don't feel wired. I don't feel a detox. But
the one that I tend to go to would be benfotiamine, just because number one, it does cross the blood-brain barrier. Number two, it does work more on neurological symptoms. And I feel that it's the less reactive one out of all of them. So I've actually, again, one of those colleagues of mine, she just texted me, I started the vitamin C and I started the B1 and I feel much better. And that wasn't within a 3-day period. That was just within a few day period.
Wow.
So it does act, and it does act fast in a lot of people, especially, I sent you a scientific literature article that a lot of people don't know that COVID and infections do lower your thiamine. So I would say, in my own clinical best opinion, that COVID is a thiaminase itself to some degree. The mechanism by which that does it, I can't speak to, but I do know the articles and the literature early in COVID into the 2020s and 2021s does support that.
Wow. Yeah. The title of that show is The Energy Gatekeeper, because he emphasized it was the first step in generating ATP is B1. I wish I would have known that back when I had COVID, because I had full body soreness. I mean, I was at a conference and it felt like people were stabbing my ankles. Like I could barely walk, but I was just megadosing ascorbic acid and it helped. I was able to make it through.
One of the reasons why the ascorbic acid helps is in that article I put up, COVID increases lipopolysaccharides. What does vitamin C do? It lowers lipopolysaccharides. What does vitamin E do? Lowers lipopolysaccharides. Goes back to my original statement about endotoxemia.
Interesting. Yeah. Makes sense. And you've been playing around with NAD, like you posted recently, the patch that you're using, and that's an alternative to IVs. So the nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, that precursor to making energy in the cell. It's a really uncomfortable IV, right? Like I've never done it, but I've heard stories.
I've never done it, but I have people that own clinics, and the response that they get when they actually see addicts use it is phenomenal. And I have a very interesting post going on my Facebook, and one of my good friends, Tom Ubel, he owns an NAD clinic, and he's seen, addicts completely turn around within hours of taking it. He's seen veterans come out of, dementia. But the thing is a lot of clinicians are utilizing it for off-label uses, and they're getting into trouble. Yes, you can use it for benzos, but it's not one of the top recommendations. And if you are having benzodiazepine, you still have to take care of other factors, because mostly people with benzodiazepines have an underlying cause of why they're on it in the first place. So if you try to do NAD and you have everything else going on, then you have a bad reaction to it. You can't blame the NAD. You've got to look at all the underlying mechanisms that got you there in the first place. And if you're going to do anything with NAD in that standpoint, you better be under medical supervision. You better have a full medical team available, because a lot can happen. You just can't go to a clinic and pop an NAD IV and not expect anything to potentially happen. You've got to have the facility. You've got to have the expertise. You got to have the count. You've got to have a team there. And that's where these clinics they're popping up all over the place. And you have to be very, very cautious of where you go. Because with the patch, we estimate you're getting roughly about 70%. So if you pop an 800 milligram patch, you're getting close to that of 500 IV. And when I did the patch, I did feel I did feel that, I won't say high, but I did feel that lift for a little while. I did feel that mental clarity. I did feel the decrease in the inflammation. But to get a good hold on things, to really how it's working, you probably have to do a series of them. Probably anywhere between 4 to 5 back to back to get a real indication.
And you're talking about iontophoresis, right? They're like
iontophoresis. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There's the company that often is Archway Compounding Pharmacy. They are one of the original founders and promoters of NAD. And they have them available through prescription, through licensed practitioner, and they do work, and there's NAD was $750 per, like, up to $1,000 per 500 milligrams. And some of the clinics are running 1,000 milligrams of NAD at a time. And if you're going to be on 1,000 milligrams of NAD, that drip's going to have to be 7 hours or longer, and it's not realistic.
Better have a good movie to watch.
Yeah. And you got to go to the facility, and stay there for 10 days. So now with the ionosphoresis patches, it makes it convenient, makes it more economical. I mean, I had the patch on, I was going out and doing daily things and, not hooked up to an IV. I didn't have to drive through a clinic. I didn't have to have a nurse on board. I didn't have to have somebody stick me. It gave you more freedom. I did feel it, but one time is not a good judge. It's a loading process, and that's commonly what's noted is, it's after 3 or 4 that you really feel the effects. And right now we're working on the process by looking at the metabolic pathways and the gene expressions to where some people may not respond to the NMNs and the NRs. Maybe they need to lower their their CD38s, So we're looking into that. And, with the help of Bob Miller, we're going to try to look at the metabolic pathways of the salvage pathway of the NAD to really get a better understanding. Because what happens is the segue of the NAD the segue of the NAD pathway is highly crucial into mycotoxins. Because what mycotoxins do is mycotoxins shut down the synthesis and they'll increase the CD38, which increases the conversion from NAD to NADH. And we have this ratio that you want more NAD to lower NADH pathway. And they have products out there now that are geared towards that, which I think is a really good idea. One of the things I found through research and looking and listening to hours is use organic parsley flakes. The organic parsley flakes has the apigenin of 45 milligrams per tablespoon. It's a crazy amount.
You talk apigenin, like the same thing in like citrus? Wow, yes. Interesting.
Apigenin. Wow. I'm actually having a lot of my clients do that now before going to bed. They'll make a tea because the apigenin, what it does is it activates on the GABA receptor sites. So it's kind of like chamomile tea on steroids. Now, a lot of my clients are, very sensitive, and chamomile may be close association to ragweed. So by using the parsley, they're having less sensitivity responses to it.
Wow. I grew up preferring cilantro to parsley, but now I'm gonna have to get that going in the greenhouse and start including it in dishes.
Yeah, and the thing is you take enough of it, it creates a sedative effect. That's why you want to take it more at nighttime. Just to give you an idea, the same amount of apigenin in chamomile tea is 2 to 3 milligrams, where parsley is 45 milligrams. Wow. And then what you do is you put it in the olive oil and you actually increase the bioavailability of it.
Wow. Have you ever tried putting different vitamins or nutrients onto those patches? So those patches have a little battery pack, and I know you can buy those by themselves. You talked about vitamin E being transdermal earlier. I wonder if there's certain things you could use to really drive it in deeper if it's necessary. I don't know.
That's a very good point, because I was looking at it. How wonderful would that to be to do glutathione in there? Put it on the chamber. My thing is the NAD concentrate didn't look like anything special. So I'm wondering, as long as the a certain nanometer or the size, is acceptable, I think you could probably put anything on there if you think about it.
What if a parsley on there? No, I'm just kidding.
I would probably say, you could probably do glutathione on there. You probably do like B vitamin in there. If you had like a B vitamin shot, amino acid therapy. Those are things that are, potential. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see that as a wave of the future in giving supplementation. Because with the supplementation and microbiome the way it is, one of my clients was reacting to B vitamins. I said, well, that's because the candida was doing it. So what I did was I found a supplement that was B complex, similar to, everything that had the B12 and folate taken out. I had to rub it on her skin. And she's like, wow, this is so much better. Like, yeah, you're bypassing your digestive tract and getting it in there. I don't know exactly what the absorption rate is, but obviously she felt it,
Wow.
and that way the organisms were not getting a hold of it. Because a lot of times, sometimes you're feeding them, not yourself.
Maybe for some people, fix the MSH deficiency and then they could take capsules again.
Well, MSH is needed to repair the leaky gut. And that's one of the things that keeps happening is people come to me with my MSH is low. Said, well, we may have to work on your MSH. Sometimes using, MSH nasal spray can work. Sometimes you may have to use, sub-Q injections, at a low dosage. Some of the recommendations that are given by, anti-aging doctors are just way too high. And sometimes you just need a little bit just to prime the wheels, Sometimes you just need plain old sunlight with Epsom salt baths, back to back for maybe 2 weeks. And that's when the client started noticing. She went for she called it her sunlight walks in the morning and at dusk. And then she did her Epsom salt baths. Digestion improved, tolerated stuff.
Wow. What can't have a COVID episode without talking about vitamin D for a minute. You mentioned, sunlight a few times, and that's just one aspect, as I said, but I know like Stephen Gundry is a huge proponent of taking, 100,000 IUs a day, a ton, acutely, to help move through something. Is that something you looked into the last, 3 years with COVID and, looked at clients' 25D test and seen any correlation there?
I have a love-hate relationship with vitamin D. Just because the fact of how I've seen it backfire on a lot of people. And, a lot of my clients were following the vitamin D protocol, but they weren't, they're making themselves worse. As I mentioned before, it's a balancing game. And we know that Americans are super high in polyunsaturated fats. And we do know that there's a competition for absorption in the GI tract. So I've been running some vitamin E profiles on people, and they're coming back, people that are taking 5,000, 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. They're driving their E into the ground. We're starting to see this on clinical documentation to where we're running, I think it was BLT Labs has it. I think it's like $25 to get a vitamin E test done. We're starting to see, the D alpha seems to be within the normal range, but we're starting to see the gamma like undetectable. And I believe there needs to be a balance between the tocopherols and tocopherols, so that, they each have their own purpose, which we haven't truly identified yet, but nature has a balance for a reason. And when you give 5,000 IUs of vitamin D, nature is 5,000 IUs vitamin D. You better have 1,000 IUs of K2 on board to balance it out. Not 5,000 to 125 micrograms or 60 micrograms or whatever, and that happens a lot, and we do know that one of the effects of COVID, it induces vitamin K deficiency. And the vitamin K deficiency actually leads into liver fibrosis. Clinical documentation is showing it. That's why I'm heavy on K2. Sometimes I have people up to 400 to 500 micrograms a day.
MK7 or 4? Or?
Usually, a good solid 200, 300 of MK7, maybe about the same or maybe 1 milligram of MK4, because they each have their own properties. And I always ask my clients, what culture has the most beautiful skin? The Japanese. Dark, very glistening. And the reason being is, what do they eat? Natto, which tastes like garbage, but it has its highest MK7, sometimes taking up that culture sometimes takes up to 1 milligram a day of MK7, which is 1,000 micrograms.
It's a lot more than Americans are getting.
It's a lot more than Americans get. And K2 has incredible properties, MK7. It actually starts the whole antioxidant cascade through FXR, SXR, and FXR, which is your bile flow. So it helps to control regulation of bile acids. It regulates phase 1 and phase 2 of the liver. It's also an anti-estrogen. When you combine K2 with vitamin E, you've got a natural anti-estrogen. That's why a lot of women that I work with, I have vitamin E. Vitamin E helps with hot flashes. Now, vitamin E in clinical studies have shown to help with postmenopausal insomnia. Because what it does is it regulates a lot of the pro-inflammatory cytokine responses. That's why vitamin E, I move heavily with COVID, because when I get those, I'm on 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. Okay, great. Okay. And then you run their vitamin D levels are jacked up, and the 125's through the roof. And it's like, have you ever thought that vitamin D is being lowered as a protective mechanism? Studies have shown that 125 also blocks the thyroid receptors and cortisol receptors. So if you have 125, high 125, you might have some thyroid problems going on.
And there's a heavy genetic component, right? And how people react. Like I know my vitamin A requirements are higher. Some people might have lower vitamin A requirements, and same goes for any vitamin, right?
Well, anybody who's got hypothyroid is not going to convert beta carotene to vitamin A, whether it's blood or cellular hypothyroidism. And what happens in that scenario is that's where like beef liver is really good. Then there's other advocates out there that are saying that vitamin A is toxic. Okay. And when you look at it, I'm like, everybody comes to me, I'm like, if you fix the bile, that won't be a problem. And one of the ways you do that is through choline. So by taking choline, you thin out your bile flow, and then vitamin A does not become as toxic as people think it does.
And a lot of people are unaware, just because I'm in the desert currently, extreme heat, been doing ice baths because it feels natural to do it in really hot. And cold exposure, like cold thermogenesis, redistributes retinol out of the liver into the fat tissue. It's kind of interesting.
Well, the other thing is it's called retinol for a reason, because you need the sunlight to activate it, because it goes through the mechanism to activate, because you get vitamin A actually through sun because it stimulates it. because that's what the name comes from, retinol. Because VDR, the VDR, the XX, the
RXR.
the RXR, those are all linked together. And one of the factors is that actually rosemary activates the VDR receptor.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is people have a vitamin D toxicity, but they also have a vitamin D deficiency. Because sometimes it's not the receptor sites sometimes it's the transport, but sometimes it's the receptor site. So that's a lot of times in certain scenarios, I'll use rosemary. And what that does is that turns on the receptor site. And when you turn on that receptor site, what's that going to do? That's going to activate your macrophages. That's going to activate the antimicrobial peptides. So what that's going to do, that's going to go kill anything in your gut, anything, viruses, even mycotoxins.
Wow. It's like rosemary tea is probably a good idea.
Rosemary tea or rosmaric acid. Even the herb rosemary itself.
Wow.
Teaspoon. Because what you're doing is the more vitamin D you take, the more you're potentially blocking that receptor site. And if you block that receptor site, it's not going to activate. And that's where it's like, is it a transport issue or is it a receptor site issue? And that's what we have to ascertain in order to come up with the approach. And you have to watch because rosemary can actually increase Bacteroides, which is a species of in your microbiome that you can get thrown off. And a lot of the microbiome tests come back with rosemary being, don't take it. So using the testing that I use is called biome site testing. It's one of the most affordable testing there is. It gives you recommendations of supplements. Like one of the clients I just did, I told her, said, I hadn't seen the results. I looked at her thing. I'm like, you need galacto-oligosaccharides, which comes from comes from a product called Galacto-Immune from Claire. It would take care of everything. So she basically ended up with Galacto-Immune and astaxanthin. And that would raise the bifidobacterium, that would raise the lactobacillus, that would take care of the Probiotic and bring the whole thing in check to where it saved her literally hundreds of dollars because you knew exactly what you had to give.
Wow. I love that we're talking about, that's all great. I love that we're talking about fat soluble vitamins just as a whole in this discussion, because recently I posted, I think you saw it, on the absorption of supplementing them. And I think when people think about supplementing vitamins, they often think of taking a multivitamin, which, growing up, I saw, when I was getting the health and looking at people's supplement cabinet, that's mostly what I saw. If they were taking individual vitamins, it was either just C or vitamin D, and that was it. But this study I found it was really interesting. Like every fat soluble vitamin almost inhibited the other's absorption when taken together, except vitamin K and E actually increased retinol absorption. So it was the reverse with K and E. Like if someone was super vitamin A deficient, you probably would want to take it with vitamin E and K2, and that would actually increase the A uptake. But every other vitamin, it was the opposite. The most suppression happened with vitamin D supplementation on A and E and all the other ones.
Yeah, and that's when people take them, they take them all in the morning, all together. That's why when you take it transdermally, you don't have to worry about that because it's all competition. It's all competition in the transport system because the same transporters they compete. So that's why if you want to take vitamin D, I always have people take vitamin D in the morning. Then I'll have them take their K2 4 hours later. Then I'll have them take their topical their topical vitamin E before going to bed. Because there's a methodology to that. Because you want to have more vitamin E before going to bed because it activates acetylcholine. It calms the inflammatory responses down so you can sleep. Vitamin E is also very antihistaminic, turns off the mast cells. And that's why it's so popular in in mold, because mold is mast cell activation. I don't, coming from these mast cell experts, I don't see anybody on vitamin E, and when I do it, it's like, faces, better skin, better hair, better sleep, and again, it lowers the lipopolysaccharides.
Yeah. I feel amazing on Rosita cod liver oil, and I've been on it for, I don't know, a year and a half now, especially in the winter. But I've started to question, like, because it's mostly A with some D. And I'm like, I'm probably not getting much D. And then the D is blocking the A. So what's making me feel so good? Is it the unknown stuff in there? Is it the omegas? What is it? It's interesting. But
Yeah, when you're dealing with natural food, it's hard to know. Plus, with Rosita, it's a very good brand, but also when were they caught? There's so many different variables that are going into these supplements that people need to take consideration of the variability. Because different, we know that when cod's caught in certain times, it's going to be higher levels of certain fats. It also depends on the area that they're caught. Different areas, different weather, different seasons affect the content
right.
of the vitamins and the fats.
I stopped eating oysters in the summer because I had one bad one at the start of the end of winter, and I was just like, I'm done. I'm going to wait till next winter.
Yeah. And the thing is with these COVID cases, you want to try to make things as simple as possible. You don't want to overload them. When people come in, zinc deficient. I'm like, okay, but if your GLA is deficient, zinc's not going to work anyway. And if that's why I run the omega quant test on people. When I run the omega test complete, it gives me a profile of what's going on in your cell membrane.
I just sent a few of those in last week. Yeah.
That's going to be interesting because what we can do is we'll do a consult and I'll show you you see the cell membrane stiffen up, but what the recommendations that they give you on the ratios, I don't see they're different than what I see clinically. And when I use a cross check, they're like, wow. I said, look at this pattern, look at this test, and look at this one. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. And again, your cell membranes are stiffening up. That's why your saturated fats are so stinking high. It usually means that there's some type of normally when I see saturated fats over 36%, I know there's stiffening of the cell membrane. So I know the body's going into cell danger response. So I'm going to think that there's going to be some type of environmental. I don't see them so much on heavy metals, but rather like mycotoxins or lime. I see the membrane stiffening up. So there's certain patterns, or you'll see that the GLA is at 0.17% when I like to see it at like 40% or higher. Okay.
Wow.
So that tells me that there's zinc deficiency. But what people don't know is that the quercetin can help with zinc absorption, but you also need the GLA to activate the zinc. Because what happens is GLA can insert itself into the same keyholes zinc does. So all these people with like pylorrhea, which is a rabbit hole itself, you give them some GLA, but then you have to make sure, do they need borage oil? Do they need evening primrose oil? You have to determine what type of GLA they need. Because you don't want to give somebody who's estrogen dominant evening primrose oil. It's going to make them more estrogen dominant. So it becomes a very delicate art form.
Wow. That's interesting. Before we go into the questions, I have one more for you, and that's regarding, so we've been talking a lot about the gut bacteria. So in my recovery, being just experimental guinea pig on myself, I basically upped spore-based probiotics and Visbiome, the packets. I think I was doing the 900 billion count. And the first day I did that, I had a really hard time going to sleep. And I wasn't wired, but tired. I just felt energized and great mood. Feel like I could have been up all night just working.
Mm-hmm.
And I still wonder what that was. And I've heard that, COVID just decimates overall your gut bacteria. I know I can imagine your response is probably going to be you want to get a GI stool map to know specifically what strains that got wiped out. But have you seen people feel better just from generally upping their probiotics after COVID?
Yeah, and you do see that, and you do see the change in the microbiome itself because of the, when you look at somebody who's COVID, their lactobacillus is going to be low, the bifidobacterium level is low, their Akkermansia is going to be either low or high. We say, oh, Akkermansia is so great, let's take it. When we see Akkermansia being on the high side is an indication of inflammatory bowel disorder. So you want to, that's why it's like, hey, maybe that AstraZeneca is not so good for you. Maybe those apple peels are not so good for you. Okay, maybe you're doing polyphenols are too much. Maybe you need to cut back on the blueberries. So you can adjust your diet accordingly. But for a person who's just generally healthy and wealthy and nothing going on, popping a probiotic's not going to, you're going to get more benefits than you are detrimental side effects. And that's why when I worked with that one guy, I'm like, you're relatively healthy. You got out of mold. You're functioning. Go ahead and try the glutathione. I don't see anything. Boom. Same thing with probiotics. You got a relatively healthy person. You can do that 900 billion or whatever it is, and have no problems and have great benefits. But then you got somebody who's sensitive. It's like, hey, it's like you do the microbiome test, and next thing you know, it's like, how about we try some Lactobacillus rhamnosus, GG, first, and then maybe some Saccharomyces, and then let's, see how you go with that, and maybe add some Gossin later, or they'll just do Saccharomyces, or they'll just do L. rhamnosus because that's the most highly studied one there is on peer review articles, and that, Shawn, my eczema's gone, and 70% of my eczema's gone within 3 days. I'm like, yeah, you just needed that one. And then they come back and do a stool sample test. I'm like, how's that possible? I said, well, L. rhamnosus cross feeds multiple organisms. So you have to know what organisms it cross feeds and how it affects, And that's why it's like you get somebody who's low Akkermansia. Akkermansia is going to cross feed Fasciculum bacterium, prebutyrate producers. So, you just don't know. And with COVID, it's like I've seen generally healthy people get blasted by COVID and turn into like turn into like vegetables, because once it hits you, you don't know what genes are going to be turned on that have been turned off. You don't know how much mold exposure that person had in college or is having now, or, because of their house they live in. Then they wonder why we are having all these problems.
Yeah, it's funny as a quote unquote influencer or whatever. When I had COVID 3 times, a lot of the trolls, the keyboard warriors were like, you're not credible because you got COVID. You're supposed to be healthy with all these supplements and hyperbaric and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking about what you said. I was raised in a beach house for the first 20 years of my life. And I was pretty much plant-based for the first 3 decades. So it's like, I didn't have a really good start. Not a lot of zinc, not a lot of amino acids, probably got hit with black mold. Who knows? So it's just funny how I think the big reason for COVID, it was, wipe out some of the population, but just to divide us more and get us fighting more. That's my.
You brought up a good point is when you're healing, the first thing is community. Go back to the tribes. Grandma and grandpa lived with their sons and daughters, took care of the grandkids. We don't have it anymore. We live in basically, sterilized caves. We don't have that community anymore. And that's what breaks us apart. I mean, with COVID, I'm also seeing pediatric cancers rising, which is scary. Okay. And a lot of it's not saying it's from the back, it's from what's being triggered. It's from the mother's not mother shaming or anything, but the microbiomes by which you have are transferred onto the kids. So if they get that vaccine and they have a poor microbiome, they're going to be more susceptible to it. And when it comes to the vaccine things, I'm neutral, but I tell people, I said, listen, if you're going to get them, you better have your kids, you better have your kids' microbiome in check. You need to have this cleared, just to play safe. Make sure you load them up on Epsom salt baths. Make sure you, maybe do other prep. Mm-hmm. And God forbid, don't give them Tylenol 24 hours before.
Yeah, that's good advice. Let's jump into some questions, Shawn, because we have a bunch. I'll just pick a few that we have time for. Tips for brain fog. Nothing seems to work regarding long COVID.
You may want to focus on acetylcholine pathways. You may want to focus on dopamine pathways. You have to be careful because if your acetylcholine levels are low, you move into dopamine, you'll have more low acetylcholine factors and vice versa. A lot of times when you overdose Parkinson's, they turn into Metavis gravitas as a result, and vice versa. So when it comes to brain fog, definitely citrulline is very good for the brain. That opens things up. You also go back to Elliot Overton's work with the thiamine. And we do have COVID, brain fog. Think about being an alcoholic. How do you feel? You feel drunk. Then you want to start working on your phenol pathways, which would be, Epsom salt bath, work on the glucuronidation pathway, maybe your aldehyde pathway. Some molybdenum might help. So there's a lot of things that can be done. But again, it's phosphatidylcholine, maybe increase your egg content because you heard somebody online tell you that eggs are bad for you. And then if they're bad for you, separate the whites and just eat the yolks. So that way, the whites are the histamine liberators.
Mm-hmm. Do you use phosphatidylserine and choline for different clients, or do you
phosphatidylserine at higher dosages is usually often used for people that have traumatic brain injuries. Using phosphatidylcholine is usually for opening up the cell membranes and increasing people's acetylcholine levels. Phosphatidylserine is also for the dosage wise is resensitizing not just the cortisol receptors, but the hormone receptors. If you use lower dosages of phosphatidylcholine, some around 50 to 100, 150 milligrams, you're going to get that resensitizing. Often people come into me with super high cortisol levels and they want to do high dosages when all you need is like 50 to 100 milligrams. You resensitize the receptor sites and you actually make the cortisol do what it's supposed to do. And sometimes that cortisol is raising because you're getting what's called cortisol resistance.
That's great. What are some top treatments you've done that had the biggest impact?
When in regards to COVID, first thing is definitely working the microbiome. Working the microbiome has been the biggest. Also working on controlling the inflammation. When you control the inflammation, you want to think about the main things that show up are IL-1, IL-6, TNF alpha, and then and kappa beta. And actually all those are controlled through this mechanism CD38 helps regulate that. So you want to get your anti-inflammatories in check. One of the biggest things I found, as long as there's no constipation, to help control the LPSs is bovine immunoglobulins. Bovine immunoglobulins have been a godsend for many, many clients. I don't use them in constipation because they can make you more constipated. But what they'll do is they will control the atomic bomb that is going off in your GI tract, so that the histamines and other endotoxins can't pass through into the gut. The other thing that we've been getting really, really good feedback on has been the resolvins, the SPMs. That we've got a lot of positive feedback on them, controlling them. The more inflammation you have, the more you got to take. The normal recommendation is usually 1 or 2 per day. But if people have more inflammation, sometimes I'll recommend, 2 capsules 2 to 3 times a day.
I use those in my recovery, and they helped quite a bit. That's great. Tips to regain smell after not having it for 2 years.
That's usually hypothalamic dysfunction. That's usually what I would do in that scenario is I would definitely clean out the sinus cavities. I would definitely think about antifungals. One of the biggest recovery mechanisms that I found, I know it sounds crazy, but when you use antifungals like Sporanox or itraconazole, can have a profound effect, because we do know that COVID is highly interlinked into mycotoxosis, and even using niacin can also work. Niacinamide is actually one of the most powerful antifungals there is. It's also associated with dealing with superbugs. Using niacin.
What kind of dosage do you use? Niacin?
500 to 1,000 BID. They've shown in clinical studies that people that use niacinamide 500 milligrams 2 times a day had a lower risk of skin cancer. And I believe that's due to the NAD.
Wow. But some people don't convert it, right? That's starting to be my understanding. Like,
some people just don't convert the niacinamide into the NMN. There's whole different pathways, and that's going to be, that's one of those mysteries that we have to start unraveling to see, NAMPT and different pathways that are upregulated, downregulated, being blocked, in order to say, hey, maybe we need to do some NAD. Let's knock down the CD38, but maybe we need, just like with testosterone, you have a negative feedback loop to the NMN pathway, and maybe have to, quote, backfill that to be fully functional. Again, those are all questions that have to remain to be answered. And that's the other thing that we're using for that, again, is, working on the acetylcholine pathway. Your anticholinergic mechanisms can help control a lot of the smell.
Awesome. Super elevated D-dimer, fibrin, high CRP. What really works? I guess a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, right? But the fibrin one is interesting. I know Elliot made a video on systemic enzymes. It was really good. And that's been used for COVID, right? So just nanokinase.
Yeah, well, there's theories about spike protein, and that your lumbar kinases and your cerebrodynases are protection against that. But again, that's not scientific fact. We know that what scientific fact and reality is in the first place. But definitely get your fibrin down using lumbar kinase and the enzymes are highly recommended.
Is it true that COVID can cause low ferritin and iron?
Anything that causes inflammation, anything that causes disturbance in the microbiome has an ability. Especially, we know that with any kind of infections, your vitamin C stores are going to be extremely low. And we need vitamin C in order to uptake ferritin itself. So there could be an absorption and also other mechanisms that we're just unaware about. That's what makes COVID a very unique, because there's not much known about it. and we don't know what all the mechanisms are. We're starting to understand some of them and get our head wrapped around them, but we don't know if this thing's going to mutate. We don't know, is it going to end up being something else?
I like your point that it triggers underlying issues, whether it's mold or I think that's an important point to make for people, because I think most people have underlying issues that their immune system somewhat keeping under check, and it's just the door is about to burst at the seams, right? And COVID is that battering ram.
I would refer to COVID as a catalyst. It's opening up, it's like Pandora's box. It's opening Pandora's box. And whatever that Pandora's box is, it's going to be relative to the person's history or what they have been treated for in the past. Because that's the number one thing when people come into COVID, when come in with the long haulers, what have you had in the past? What have you been exposed to? I mean, I've seen cases where it reactivated teeth issues, dental issues. Wow. So you have to take, as a practitioner, you have to take that deep dive and just get into the history. Maybe they worked in a plant that had aspartame or something. Mm-hmm. You got to take that deep dive and you got to get your hands dirty in order to know where to go.
I love it. Well, Shawn, this was fun. Your website, is it Matrix Health?
They can contact me at matrixhealthwell@gmail.com is probably the best location, best email address.
Great. And I have to take you up on that omega quant. I'm curious to see my 24 fatty acid levels. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and then you can see that cotton liver oil is working for you or against you.
I'm completely open, as people know. But the one thing I don't like with those at-home tests, I'd almost rather get stuck, because the lancet they include, it's a slice. I prefer the prick, but with this one, you have to prick multiple times to get enough blood. Do you know about that?
Yeah, you sometimes do. You're not a bleeder. If you're clotting too fast. But right. They actually do have, you can request to have the phlebotomy. You can request to have the tubes done. They do offer.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they do offer that.
Oh.
I still think it's red blood cell. I don't think it's plasma. And a lot of them, there's some laboratories out there, no name mentioned, but their red blood cells information is completely inaccurate based upon clinical data. And when practitioners are utilizing that data, they're not using proper metrics. And it's thrown a lot of my clients off as a result.
Wow. Interesting. Well, awesome. Well, yeah, thanks, Shawn. This was great. A lot of fun.
Sure.
I love your posts and information. Thanks for what you do. And stick around as we close out the show.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on, Matt.
I always learn so much when I speak with Shawn. I love how his mind works, looking at these different problems and the solutions that he comes up with. One of the most fascinating things that he talked about that I want to dive into more is beta glucans and how they allow the microbiome to shift and how they even protect against electromagnetic fields. I'm going back to Idaho soon because I prefer the forest much more so to the desert. And one of my favorite things out of the many things of winter is keeping a brew of chaga tea going on the wood stove all day, every day, because I keep the fire going pretty much 24/7 and just sipping that all winter long. I know most people use a crock pot on low or some type of heating apparatus, but to me, there's something very special about brewing chaga on a wood stove without electricity. It's just a whole different experience than even heating it on the stove. Maybe it's in my head, but to me, it tastes better. I also thought the MSH thing was interesting, melanocyte stimulating hormone for gut health. I see a lot of people talking about gut health, and I'm a huge fan of fiber. It's personally helped me a ton. Going almost fiber free for a couple of years definitely did not help my gut health. But UV light for gut health, even for people in northern climates where the UV index goes down to almost nothing for several months, there's many excellent UV devices out there. The Spurti is one of the most popular. I've found better ones since then. One of my favorite ones is the Chroma light. It's a little pricey, but I like that they integrate near infrared and other frequencies of light that help to balance out the UV. But with that one, you have to be really careful because it could actually blind you. So I'm really careful where I point that thing, and you can get a pretty severe burn if you leave it on one spot for too long. So you kind of do sweeps on the body with it. I also thought the GLA thing was really interesting, that's required, that fat, to activate zinc. So looking at borage oil or evening primrose oil, depending on someone's estrogen state. I know for me, growing up, not liking meat, and specifically red meat, because I probably didn't have access to high quality grass-fed meat, I didn't eat a lot of it. So I had a chronic zinc deficiency for most of my life. So really emphasizing high zinc sources is really important for me. Red meat, oysters, and just supplementing elemental zinc, like the zinc carnosine that I sell under Mitolife. It's been extremely helpful for me. I take one every night before bed, and usually one with breakfast. So I hope this show got your wheels turning about a lot of different things. If you want to work with Shawn, you can email him. Like he mentioned, it's matrixhealthwell@gmail.com. If you want to dive deeper into my work, you can go to matt-blackburn.com. I have the CLF protocol up there, calcification, lipofuscin, and fibrosis, and to go into all of the nuance of what causes them and solutions. Those are three things that accumulate in the body over time and accelerate aging and contribute to disease. If you click on shop, you can see all of my recommended products. I recently added the nettle root spiguric from a company called Lost Empire Herbs. I recently interviewed the founder, Logan Christopher, and this is one of my favorite products that I've been taking from them for several years, and it synergizes great with so many things. Shilajit, elk velvet antler, and as a male, it really supports prostate health, which tends to go downhill over time. Then you can check out the Mitolife products. That's at mitolife.co. Right now, there's a sale going on for the oyster. It's buy one, get one free through the end of the month. I think this product really shines when we're in months without R in them. So months where oysters are not really in season, then you could pop 4 capsules or more every day and get all of the benefits of the zinc, iodine, selenium, copper, B12, biotin. It's really a powerhouse of nutrition, and generally iodine is overlooked. A lot of people just supplement that in isolation. I prefer to get it from oysters. And then check out the Mitolife Academy. That's on YouTube. I put out 2 videos a month of my latest revelations and experiments and things that I've learned. And then once a month, which happens to be today as we release this episode, I do a live Q&A where you can ask me anything. So that's it for today's show. I'll see you guys next week. Stay supercharged.